You watch the bright red and white plastic bobber twitch, dance erratically, and finally plunge violently beneath the surface of the water, signaling what looks like a textbook aggressive bite. You wait that extra split second to be absolutely sure, sweep the rod tip back firmly to set the hook, and feel absolutely nothing but the weight of your own rig flying back at you through the air. You reel in the slack only to find your hook completely stripped, the entire nightcrawler gone, successfully stolen by a fish that is supposedly the easiest species in North America to catch. This exact frustrating sequence happens because putting a massive, folded ball of worm on a standard hook completely ignores the biological reality of how a bluegill actually eats. The tension you feel when a fish repeatedly steals your bait without getting hooked isn't bad luck, and it isn't a sign that the fish are too small to catch. It is a direct mechanical failure caused by the fact that the bluegill's mouth gape and specific suction-feeding mechanics turn a large glob of bait into a puzzle they can easily pick apart without ever touching the steel. By the end of this video, you will know the exact, simple way to thread and size your worm that physically forces the fish to take the hook point into its mouth on the very first strike, completely eliminating bait stealers. There are 3 specific things this video covers: the physics of how a bluegill's opercular suction interacts with the mass of your bait, why the linear profile of the worm on the hook matters far more than the total size of the worm, and how adjusting your float's water displacement changes a hesitant nibble into a fully committed strike. None of this requires buying specialized new bait, upgrading to expensive ultralight gear, or spending hours tying complex rigs on the bank. Picture a typical local public pond, specifically standing on a weathered wooden dock with a thick patch of submerged coontail weed extending just a few feet out from the wooden pilings. The sun is high overhead, creating a very distinct, sharp shadow line right underneath the edge of the boards. Most anglers walk up to this spot, break off a massive chunk of a nightcrawler, fold it over the hook 3 or 4 times, and drop that giant ball of bait right on the edge of the shadow, assuming a bigger presentation automatically draws a bigger fish. But this is exactly where a fundamental misunderstanding of basic bluegill physiology begins to cost you consistent catches. Bluegill belong to the sunfish family, and unlike a largemouth bass that possesses a massive, bucket-like mouth allowing it to flare its gills and inhale a huge volume of water and large prey in one sudden vacuum strike, the bluegill is built differently. A bluegill has a highly specialized, morphologically limited, very small mouth gape that is structurally designed by nature to precisely pick tiny insects, small larvae, and microscopic zooplankton out of the water column or carefully pull them off submerged vegetation. When you present a large, thick, folded-over clump of earthworm, you're actively giving them an object that physically cannot fit into their buccal cavity in a single inhalation attempt. Because they cannot engulf the bait, they do exactly what their anatomy dictates. They approach the object, use their highly acute vision to find a dangling end of the worm that isn't pierced by the hook, bite down securely on that specific soft appendage, and swim backward in a quick burst. They literally tear the worm off the hook, piece by piece, because your rigging method has inadvertently turned your single bait into a grazing buffet rather than an easily consumable single target. To stop this cycle of stolen bait, we have to rebuild the entire presentation from the hookup, fundamentally altering the bait's profile to force a full, unavoidable inhalation. The first critical adjustment is mastering the hooking profile and respecting the fish's suction threshold. The absolute most common beginner error is taking a whole nightcrawler, breaking off a thick 2-inch chunk, and piercing it through the middle multiple times to create a dense, round ball of meat centered on the hook shank. The standard assumption is that a dense ball effectively hides the sharp metal point of the hook from the fish's sight and provides a heavily concentrated scent cloud that the fish simply cannot resist. But what this actually does in the water is create a dense, heavy, unnatural mass that requires a significant amount of water displacement and negative pressure to move into the fish's mouth. When a bluegill approaches this dense ball, its natural suction feeding mechanism, which relies on rapidly expanding the opercular flaps to draw water inward, simply isn't strong enough to pull that entire heavy mass through its small lips. Instead, the fish just grabs the softest outer edge that requires the least amount of effort to move. To fix this mechanical flaw, you must test a completely different hooking geometry, the straight thread technique. Take a single piece of worm that is absolutely no longer than 1.5 inches in total length. Insert the extremely sharp point of a thin wire hook directly into the broken flat end of the worm segment. Carefully thread the worm straight up the long shank of the hook, exactly like you would thread a hollow body soft plastic swim bait onto a base jig, leaving just a tiny, 1/4 inch tail dangling freely past the metallic bend of the hook. This exact method creates a slim, highly streamlined profile that offers 0 dangling loops or loose ends for the fish to grab and pull. When the bluegill attempts to eat this specific shape, the narrow profile slides effortlessly into its small mouth via the natural suction of the water, ensuring the metal hook point is immediately positioned inside the oral cavity on the very first attempt. If you test this straight thread presentation and the fish are still somehow managing to nip the bait without getting hooked, the tiny tail you left dangling past the hook bend is still slightly too long for the size of the fish in that specific school. Simply pinch that tiny tail off with your fingernail until the worm ends exactly at the curve of the hook, leaving absolutely nothing extending past the metal. Once you solve the physical profile of the bait, the next factor that dictates whether that hook actually sets or pulls free is the wire diameter and weight of the hook itself. The second crucial element is selecting the correct hook wire gauge to control the hydrodynamic drop rate. The standard mistake here is reaching into the bottom of the tackle box and tying on whatever leftover bait holder hooks happen to be available, which are usually thick gauge, heavy steel hooks originally meant for catching catfish, carp, or large bass. The thick wire of a heavy hook seems like a perfectly safe bet because it won't ever bend or break under pressure, but the dense thickness of that metal fundamentally alters how your small bait behaves as it falls through the water column. A thick, heavy bait holder hook adds immense, unnatural weight to a very small piece of threaded worm, causing the entire rig to plummet rapidly toward the bottom like a stone, rather than drifting downward slowly like a true piece of organic, living forage. Bluegill are heavily visually oriented predators that are biologically programmed to track the slow, erratic, fluttering descent of small terrestrial insects falling from the surface canopy or aquatic larvae being gently washed in from the bank. When your heavily hooked bait falls far too fast, it forces the fish into a rushed reaction strike rather than a confident feeding strike, meaning the bluegill often just slaps at the bait or nips at the very edge quickly before it escapes into the bottom debris, leading to terrible hookup ratios. The practical field test to check this is to simply drop your fully rigged, hooked bait into the water right at your feet next to the dock, where you can clearly watch it sink. If the bait plunges straight down vertically and disappears into the depths in less than 2 seconds, your hook hardware is significantly too heavy for the presentation. You must switch immediately to a fine wire, long shank Aberdeen style hook, specifically in a size 8 or a size 10. The remarkably thin wire of an Aberdeen hook dramatically reduces the overall mass and density of the terminal presentation, allowing the small threaded worm to flutter, glide, and sink at a naturally slow pace. This deliberately slow drop gives the observing bluegill plenty of time to position its body, visually inspect the streamlined bait, and confidently inhale it using its natural, unhurried feeding posture. If you switch to a thin wire hook and the bite suddenly stops entirely, you may be fishing in an area with an unexpected subsurface current or a heavy wind drift that is pushing your ultralight, slow-falling rig horizontally out of the strike zone before it ever reaches the correct depth where the fish are holding. In that specific environmental scenario, you need to add a single, incredibly tiny, micro-split shot sinker attached exactly 12 inches above the hook, just enough concentrated weight to break the surface tension and combat the drift, but not enough to ruin the slow, fluttering fall of the bait itself. But even a perfectly threaded, streamlined worm falling beautifully on a light wire hook will be violently rejected if the fish feels the wrong kind of mechanical resistance at the surface of the water. The third vital component is understanding float displacement and the mechanics of strike rejection. The universal standard approach for almost all bank anglers targeting panfish is to attach a large, classic red and white spherical plastic bobber directly to the main line, usually measuring about 1.5 inches in diameter. The underlying logic for this choice is simply that a bigger, brighter bobber is much easier for the human eye to see from a distance, and its massive volume easily supports the weight of the bait and sinkers without ever sinking below the surface. However, a large, hollow spherical float contains immense trapped buoyancy and creates massive water displacement when pulled downward. When a small bluegill flares its gills to suck in your carefully threaded worm, the fishing line instantly pulls downward on that highly buoyant, air-filled sphere resting on the surface. The massive volume of the sphere actively fights back against the pull, creating instant, unnatural vertical resistance that violently jerks the bait backward in the fish's mouth. Because bluegill possess a highly sensitive lateral line system and are incredibly attuned to pressure changes in their immediate environment, they instantaneously register this heavy, rigid resistance as an unnatural tether attached to their food. Their basic survival instinct immediately kicks in. They abruptly spit the bait out to avoid danger, and by the time that large, clumsy spherical bobber actually registers a visible twitch on the surface. For you to see, the fish has already rejected the hook and swam away. The direct test for this issue is strictly observing the float's behavior during a bite. If your spherical bobber is constantly dancing around, laying flat on its side, or vibrating rapidly on the surface without ever actually plunging under the water, the fish are actively feeling the buoyancy resistance and refusing to commit to the final inhalation. To permanently solve this resistance problem, you must switch your setup to a slender pencil-style slip float or a tiny, elongated foam strike indicator. The slim, aerodynamic profile of a pencil float slices vertically downward through the surface tension and the water column with a tiny fraction of the resistance created by a wide sphere. When the bluegill inhales the threaded bait beneath a pencil float, the thin indicator slips silently and smoothly under the surface, and the fish feels absolutely no unnatural pressure pulling back against its mouth. If you are using a slender pencil float and it suddenly starts laying completely flat, horizontally on the surface, instead of standing vertically, it means a bluegill has picked up the bait from below and is actively swimming upward toward the surface with it, entirely relieving the weight of the sinker from the line. That specific visual cue is your absolute signal to reel in the slack line immediately and sweep the rod tip to set the hook before the fish realizes the trick. Everything covered in this breakdown so far: the slim, straight profile of the threaded worm, the slow, natural fall of the light wire Aberdeen hook, and the low resistance displacement of the pencil float, assumes you're waiting for the float to disappear completely under the water to know the fish has taken the bait. But understanding what the fish is actually doing from a biological standpoint forces a completely different reading of the signals you see on the surface. A bluegill inspecting a properly threaded, perfectly sized bait on a light wire hook often doesn't need to swim away aggressively to secure its meal. Because the bait is now small, streamlined, and perfectly matched to its anatomical gape, the fish simply hovers in place, flares its gills to create suction, and inhales the worm while remaining completely stationary in the water.